Hello, welcome to the Chalke Valley History Show on Thursday the 25th of June. Well, today we've got Adam Rutherford, we've got Annette Gordon-Reed, we've got living history, we're going into the archives, we've got a whole host of other things beside. And don't forget, you can follow us on social media all this week here.
Hello there, Chalke Valley History Festival people. It's Al Murray here. James Holland's erstwhile partner in crime at We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the Second World War podcast of varying degrees of seriousness. Now, I have an object, and what is it? Well, it's this, paperweight. A paperweight that I got from a company a few years ago called Airframe Assemblies Limited. Now, Airframe Assemblies Limited, if you're lucky enough to get the chance, are people who basically refit Spitfire airframes. So if you have the spare cash to buy a Spitfire, if you've got the readies to get your hands on a Spitfire, and I think it's a couple of million these days, you take it to Airframe Assemblies and you say, right, okay, these bits need fixing. So they'll put new wings on it for you, they'll put new tail on it, they'll put new cockpit in. Basically, you can have a George Washington's axe triggers broom Spitfire and have one completely remade from top to toe at Airframe Assemblies. Right, or at least the parts made now. I visited there a few years ago and was very lucky to get the full guided tour, and they gave me this paperweight. Now, this paperweight is a cross-section of the main spar of a Spitfire's wing with concentric aluminium pieces. Now, the Spitfire had two of these, and basically what you have is these rounded rectangle edge pieces of aluminium with a central hole. And they all fit into each other snugly like so. And then they're bent, they're kinked on a jig so that they're locked together. They're not actually bound together, they're locked together by the pressure of being jigged together. Now this meant that the Spitfire's wing had through it two spars of very great strength and lightness as well. You didn't need to make this out of steel. R.G. Mitchell came up with a way of making a main spar that was super light and actually kind of flexible, because it actually had some give in it too, that ran through the centre of the Spitfire's famous elliptical wings. So I'm very lucky in that I managed to blag a paperweight that's the heart of a Spitfire's secret of flight. How about that? Not bad, eh?
Thank you very much.
Well, Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, we are thrilled to have you here. You've come all the way over from Harvard University, you know, one of the most famous universities in the whole entire world. So thank you for coming and welcome to Chalke Valley.
Happy to be here.
Now, your subject tonight, I know, I'm really excited about your talk, is going to be Thomas Jefferson.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Jefferson's such an amazing man, isn't he? Founding father, man of the Enlightenment, ambassador in Paris, but also, plantation owner.
Absolutely. Jefferson sort of embodies the paradox, people say, of the American dilemma: slavery and freedom in one place in Monticello. Yeah.
So, how do you, as a black historian, how do you kind of square that?
Well, I think it made sense. And there was a historian, Edmund Morgan, who said that slavery made American freedom possible for whites, because it really did tamp down on class warfare. Mm-hmm. People who were lower class did not they actually had someone to look down upon, and it sort of tempered any kind of anger they would have had at the upper classes. So it actually worked in its own way, as a buffer. They were a buffer against the possibility that there might be a revolt about the economic system in general. So race has always been something of a surrogate for class in the United States.
How is he viewed in the United States today in the 21st century?
Well, his reputation has taken something of a hit, as we've talked about and begun to think much more about race and about slavery before. And well, he was always a controversial figure. There were people who hated him during his time. He was a big supporter of the French Revolution for longer than perhaps he should have been. People were dying at this time, and people understood that things were falling apart.
Of course, it was a terror.
Yeah, it was a terror, but he thought it was worth it, that in the end it would be worth it. And so that made him controversial. People were concerned about his religious views. He was skeptical of religion, and people actually thought that he was an atheist. And so there was always something about him that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But for the most part, he was very, very much respected. Certainly in the 20th century, FDR loved Jefferson, and he was the one who put up the Jefferson Memorial. And then when we came to the Civil Rights Movement, people began to say, wait a minute, there's this other side of him that we have to look at. So I would say right now, people see him as, well, he's a flawed founder, and still admire him, but do focus on more on his attitudes about race and his attitudes about slavery.
And how do you feel that history is studied in the United States these days? And is it still considered important? I mean, do most people know the basic?
Well, I think it depends on where you are, but I do, if there's a concern right now, and I know STEM is important, technology, those things are important, but there's such a focus on that sometimes history classes in public schools get short shrift.
Right.
And social studies, anything that's, the humanities in general. History teaches you how to write, gives you a civics education,
it
teaches
teaches
you
you
understanding of the world, the present, all of those kinds of things. So we're really pushing back against the idea that you can have any kind of cutback in history. So it's not totally under siege, but there are areas of concern.
Yeah, and presumably as a historian, I mean, you would agree that the study of the past is absolutely vital.
Absolutely. I don't understand how people think you can function in society. You don't function in your own life without knowing this is what happened to me, this is what I did, this has brought me to this particular point, and this is where I want to go.
And this has brought
That's the
us
life
the
of a
nation.
nation. It's the life of a nation. History shows that.
Yeah, I would say that history doesn't repeat itself, but patterns of human behaviour do, and there's all sorts of things that have happened in our recent past where you think, gosh, if people had just read their history a little better, perhaps they
know
wouldn't
that's not
have.
going to work.
This is not going to work. Around 2003, it's something that kind
exactly.
of leaps to mind.
Yeah, or invading Russia in the winter. I mean, there are things that,
Right.
or invading Russia at all.
Oh, yeah.
That's not a good plan. So, yeah, I mean, it tells you, it warns you about the past, but it also gives you. A friend of mine, John Meacham, has written a new book about it that's sort of designed to get people to out of this notion that we're in sort of an intractable situation at the moment in America. And then he goes back and he looks at other times when things looked really, really bleak, and he talks about how people got out of that. So it's about warning you about the past, not to make mistakes, but it also gives you a sense of human potential, that people can rise to occasion. So it's important to study it.
Well, over the years, we've been incredibly lucky here at the festival to have some fantastic historians from all around the world. And one of those was Professor Annette Gordon-Reed. And actually, when she did come, it was a glorious, hot, sunny day. And everyone kept going up to her and saying, "Are you all right? Are you sure you're not too hot?" And of course, she kept saying, "I come from the deep south in America. I know a thing or two about heat." Anyway, next up is one of our main talks, and this is by the brilliant, incomparable Adam Rutherford.
The concept of race as we think about it today, which very much is entwined with the science of human genetics, which is what I study, and human variation. But the ideas of race that we are familiar with, that we use in the everyday, when we describe the people of the world, is a relatively modern phenomenon, and it's not inherent to biology, which is something that genetics has shown in the 20th and 21st century, but in fact was a construction of a new taxonomy of humans that really coincides with this astonishing era in Europe from the 15th century onwards, associated with the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, all those things. But before that, we have descriptions of different people of the earth and different characteristics of the people of the earth, including pigmentation being the most obvious way of looking at the differences between people. But there is very little evidence that earlier cultures in history used pigmentation as a primary way of determining what people were like. And that really begins in about the 16th, 17th century as Europeans are beginning to expand around the world. And in many ways it is the marshalling of some invented science, some pseudoscience as we now see it, in order to reinforce a political ideology, which is the subjugation of people in the colonies. So the link between classifying humans, classifying all biology, and the history of Europe within the last 400 or 500 years, they're entirely intertwined. They're pretty much inseparable. But I think a lot of people don't realise, and I didn't really realise until I really got stuck into this as a subject, that these classifications are new. They're not ancient. And when we look in ancient history, we find completely different sets of taxonomy that are not the same and don't rely on the same categorizations that people think of today, which are associated with science, with genetics. The birth of my field formally is really within the last 150 years, but genetics is really only the study of inheritance and the study of how we pass characteristics down from parent to child, and it is the study of sex. But those are ideas that we've been thinking about for thousands, tens of thousands of years, and they only become formalized in this sort of milieu of Victorian science, which also emerges from the field of anthropology, and anthropology effectively emerges from European expansionism. So again, we go back to the age of exploration, the age of plunder. And so what we see is the sort of formalization of meeting people around the world as Europeans are invading or exploring around the rest of the world. We see interested parties trying to formalize in a scientific way, or now we regard it as pseudo-scientific, but seeing and interacting with the people of the rest of the world and trying to categorize them. And it is this very, very human characteristic of trying to classify everything. We have a very natural desire to try and put things in neat boxes. And this fundamentally is where the discrepancy between what the science of genetics now tells us in the 21st century and what is said over the last 200, 300, 400 years as we've looked at the differences between people, because evolution does not adhere to nice, neat boxes. One of the things that we are very bad at recognizing is that our family trees are not trees at all, and that they're matted webs that intertwine over many generations until eventually we become descended from the same people within the last 1,000 years or so, if you're largely of European extraction. And so trying to say, well, these people are Anglo-Saxons, or these people are the Dutch, or these people are African. When we try to do that now using racial epithets that are familiar to all of us, they make no sense scientifically, because we understand genealogy and we understand genetics in a way. They're just not reflected in what we understand about human variation today. So the trajectory for the science of genetics has been to move further and further away from what I argue in the book is effectively the marshalling of a pseudoscience in order to reinforce a political ideology. So it is sort of, genetics now is, we hope, is much more ethically neutral or politically neutral than it has been in the past. It still is mired in political and race-based controversies, but we're a long way from what I think is the foundation of the field of human genetics, which is that we're not just going to classify, we are going to classify with hierarchy. People are different and these people are better, and because it was Europeans doing the classifications, it's always Europeans who are better than everyone else. So all the evidence we now have amassed over the last century and more, based on paleontological, so that's old bones, cultural artifacts, so the stuff we find alongside old bones, and now more than ever genetic evidence that we carry inside us, that everyone carries. This is an amazing treasure trove of information about our past that every one of us has inside ourselves, but which has only been accessible for the last decade or so, tops. All of that evidence now really definitively points towards Homo sapiens being an African species. And what we mean by that is that the majority of our evolution occurred within Africa, and the foundations of us as a species from earlier versions of humans all occurred within Africa. We genetics has not usurped paleontology or paleanthropology at all. It's just complemented it. And so we continue to discover new fossil remains all over Africa. And that's one of the key things that has changed in the last 10 years, is that since the 1960s, since the Leakeys were finding really significant human remains in the east of Africa, in the Rift Valley, dating the oldest of which was around 200,000 years ago in Ethiopia. The most recent discoveries have found much older Homo sapiens particularly in a place called Jebel Irud, which is in Morocco, and they appear to be around about 300 to 315,000 years ago. And they're Homo sapiens there, and they're Homo sapiens in Ethiopia, in East Africa, and we think they're the same species. We think that they're us. And so we're now moving towards a sort of a much more complex picture of our own origins, still all within Africa, but we appear to be more of a sort of gestalt species where multiple different types of humans from around Africa are sort of, they're meeting each other, they're having sex with each other, and we, as the species that we recognize today, emerges from this giant continental orgy. One of the things that this very clearly says is that the proportion of people who left Africa around about 70 to 80,000 years ago, from whom the rest of the world is largely descended, was a tiny fraction of the people who were in Africa at that time. And this is very much reflected in our genetics. So when we say things like the genetic diversity within Africa is far greater than the genetic diversity in the rest of the world put together. And what we mean by that is that there's more differences between people in Africa when we look at their DNA than if we look at anyone else, me, you, anyone in the audience, or even to the extent that if you look at people within the same group within Africa, they are more likely to be more different to each other than each one of them is to anyone else in the rest of the world. Now, again, this sounds sort of counterintuitive. It sounds counter-experiential. If you take people from, for example, the Khoisan or the Khoikhoi or San tribesmen, Bushmen, they call themselves, but we no longer do. The amount of difference genetically between them is likely to be more than a San Bushman and me or you, because of this facet of most evolution occurring within Africa, and only a small sampling error of genetic diversity left Africa. Now that is it feels like a challenging and confrontational thing to say. It feels often that this runs counter to one's experience, because we tend to classify people by recent and superficial characteristics such as pigmentation. You look at two black men and you say, well, they have this characteristic which is different from European light skin, light pigmentation. But that is evolution's deceit. It is a very superficial characteristic that is not representative of the overall differences between people within Africa. And that again is something that really only emerged as a categorizer in the 16th and 17th century, this very shallow history of race as we understand it today. One of the things that genetics has done I think a sort of almost magical way in the last few years, and I've talked about this before at Chalke Valley, is we've got so good at identifying the incredibly wispy, diaphanous differences between people and between populations that we can now look at maps and plot the differences and similarities between people. Now, this again, it's great headline stuff, and the maps themselves look amazing, and you see them in the papers and you say, well, amazingly, we can now tell the difference between the people of Devon and Cornwall based on their genetics, and the barrier between them is the Tamar. Right? And you think, well, that's amazing, because genetics recapitulates history. It says that these people are different from each other and they have different cultures. Now, this all has to be caveated so heavily, because we are incredibly similar genetically as a people. We all have the same ancestors, only a few generations back. You know, I'm probably fourth or fifth cousins with 90% of the people watching this, because we have British heritage. But genetics got so good at identifying the really, really fine scale differences between people that we can draw out these maps and say, you know, for example, the English-speaking bit of Wales, Little England beyond Wales, they bizarrely have more in common genetically with mainland Englanders than they do with the rest of the Welsh population. Now, it's almost meaningless, apart from the fact that the political connotations and the recapitulation of history that goes with that is well, I think much more significant than the fact that you can actually identify it genetically. I think, and I'm saying this as a geneticist, that genes are much less important than the history, than the culture, than the politics of similarity and difference. And the fact that genetics can recapitulate British and indeed world history is fascinating and important, and it adds another string to the bow of understanding our own history. But I think this is really important, it says nothing about our tribal identities. It says nothing significant about the justification for the differences or political interactions which rest upon those differences, because those differences are so fine and so slight as to be inconsequential. So one of the ideas that I explore in the book is sport, and I recognise that not everyone is into elite sport in the same way that I am. But I think that sport is really important in this discussion, because for a long time and at the moment, this is one of the ways that we see other people of the world at extremes of abilities. You know, the physical skill, the physicality, the physiology of people from around the world. And what we see is that people are different, and we see clustering of success within specific sports. The two examples that are most obvious are long distance running and sprinting, where, well, for example, in the Olympic 100 meters, there hasn't been a white man since Alan Wells in 1980, and that was the Moscow Olympics, so the Americans weren't there because they were boycotting Soviet Russia. And it's since then, every single competitor in the final, and therefore winner, has been a man of West African descent in the Americas, either the Caribbean, America, or Canada. And so you look at that data set and you think, well, that's pretty compelling evidence, isn't it? You know, I'm not saying anything negative here about these characteristics. In fact, quite the opposite. This is what we refer to as positive attribute racism, where you say these are a group of people who, for reasons that we can get into, but whatever the reasons are, they appear to be predisposed to short distance running more than any other group of people on Earth. And similarly, East Africans have dominated long distance running now for well, decades, I suppose. And primarily they come from Ethiopia or Kenya. Now, those two different sports are, the genetic explanations for them are different from each other. And the Ethiopian-Kenyan one, long distance running, is somewhat easier to explain. And it's really important to recognise that sport is not a level playing field. It is a thing in which it is an endeavour, a human endeavour, in which underlying physical differences between people give you absolute advantages. The most obvious and trivial example is tall people are better at basketball. You know, short people are better jockeys. Right? Those are just facts, and they need to be recognised as such. The people of Kenya and Ethiopia who have ancestry associated with living at high altitude, at high elevation, does mean that they have a genetic predisposition to being able to process oxygen at a more efficient rate than people whose ancestry is at lower levels, lower elevation. And that is undoubtedly part of their advantage in elite success at long distance running. However, is it enough to be unique to that group of people and therefore categorizable as that this is a sort of a pure racial advantage that these people have over everyone else? And the answer to that is clearly no, because we know that this is a ephemeral success. How long it will last, we don't know, but the Finns utterly dominated long distance running for 20 or 30 years up until the Second World War, with more medals and records in the Olympics and other long distance competitions than any other group of people. Did they have the same genetic advantage? Well, probably, we think so. We also see Moroccan long distance runners. We also see a few Mexican long distance runners. They, incidentally, the genetic advantage is we understand what part of the genes that give you that advantage are, and they're similar to people who have Tibetan ancestry. Do we see Tibetan long distance runners? No, we do not. There's other reasons for that, but the main reason is that there is no culture of long distance running, not specifically amongst the Tibetans, who also have a very different body shape, so possibly a bad example. But when you actually look at the motivations for being successful at long distance running for Ethiopians and Kenyans, genetics is part of it. That's the bottom line. But the other motivations are all cultural things. The other successes are based upon having successful athletes within those groups who then go and set up schools. There is a financial imperative, there is a social imperative, and without going into the same level of detail, in every single one of these examples, which we think of as being, this is a group of people who are genetically predisposed to being better at this particular sport, what we find is that the iniquity that that their elite athlete status is demonstrating is far more influenced by cultural things than it is by genetic. And again, this is me as a geneticist saying genetics is much less important than we might think. Consumer genetic tests have become very popular in the last few years. This was something that we did not anticipate would happen in the genetics community, and it's been quite a ride over the last few years. So these are tests like Ancestry.com and 23andMe and a whole bunch of other tests that you can buy. I'm sure some of you will have done this. You spit in a tube, you give someone £100 and they give you a map of where your ancestors are from. Now, I have some cynicism about the value of these for a number of reasons, but the main one is that there isn't actually a way of doing what a lot of people think they're buying. So that isn't a scientifically valid thing that you can do. You can't tell from DNA where your ancestors are from. What you can do is you can infer where they're from by looking at where you have shared genetics with people living on the earth today. So what you're actually doing is you're comparing your DNA with the database that the company has of other paying customers. And so what they will show is the majority of your DNA is closely associated with, say, Northern Europe, and more specifically the UK, and even to a finer degree than that. Mine's relatively interesting, I suppose, because my mother was Indian, so 50% of my DNA looks a lot like European DNA. My dad is from Yorkshire, and 50% of my DNA looks like 1.3 billion Indians. There's an interesting side note within that, which is that the resolution of those maps is determined by how many paying customers they have. So my European DNA can be granularized right down to 1.2% looks like Sweden, 1% looks like Denmark, a lot of it looks like Yorkshire, little clusters all around northwest Europe. The Indian half of it is just one big block. I apparently am genetically identical to more than 1 billion Indians because very few Indians have taken the test, because the test is associated with socioeconomic status. If you've got £100 to blow on spitting in a tube to find out who your ancestors were, that's where the database actually comes from. So I think they're of trivial interest. I think they can tell you things at a level of detail which is not much greater than I could tell you by looking at you and asking you a few questions about your surname and your family. And I think most people recognize that they're pretty trivial. But I think that the effect that they've had is to reinforce ideas about genetic identity and genetic determinism that we thought in the genetics community we had successfully eroded, or that we'd put those ideas to bed. And I feel like these tests have had the effect of actually reinforcing a very human characteristic, which is to look for signifiers of tribal identity. And so, I get loads of emails from people either asking or telling me that they're descended from Vikings. And I don't really know how to process this, because if you look at the genetic genealogy, the Vikings are a group of people who exist in Europe before the point where we know the entire population is the ancestor of the entire population of Europe today. So all Europeans are descended from Vikings, and that's just a fact. So when people have spent £100 to find out that they've got some Scandinavian ancestry in them, I feel like saying, I can tell you this for free. But I think it's a reflection of people's desire for belonging and for meaning and for cultural identity, which are very human characteristics. But part of my, I suppose, quest and my mission as a public communicator of genetics is to tell people again that genes are much, much less important than history, than politics, than family, and then all of those identifying factors that we construct that are cultural. You won't find answers to who you are in your genes. You'll find them in your history.
Okay, so here I'm just representing being an Iron Age blacksmith. So that would be a blacksmith in Britain from around about 800 BC through to around 1st century AD, maybe 43 AD, when the Romans come and arrive and decide to stay. I'm trying to use the same equipment that we think they would have had at this time. Now, some of the things like the anvils and the hammers, they exist in the archaeology, so it's quite easy. We can reproduce those as accurately as we can to test out what it would have been like using their equipment. Things like the forge and the bellows, however, that's what doesn't survive. So we have to try and piece that together from any descriptive information, so anything written by Roman or Greek authors, Roman frescoes as well, showing Roman blacksmiths, but also we use ethnoarchaeology, looking at other cultures which are alive today, who are just similar to what we see in the Iron Age, and working at how they do it, how they operate and work a forge without any modern equipment. So these bellows themselves, they are similar to a forge in Africa and Sudan and the equipment they're using. The forge itself, it's a real amalgamation. It's a mixture of descriptions of 14th century forges, of Roman forges, and again of forges we see in Africa being used. So more on the bellows here. As I said, they're similar styles to ones we see in Africa. What we have is we have a large sleeve of leather with wooden paddles on the top and a leather banding. And how these ones are working is there's actually a leather valve inside. So when I press down, I seal the hole with my hand and the valve closes up, allows us to push air through. When I raise my hand, the valve can open and allow air in. And just using this simple method, we can get this forge using charcoal up to around 1200 degrees centigrade, just with this base equipment. And although it might seem quite simple and archaic, what they were able to produce on these forges were actually incredible. And the metalwork from the Iron Age, the artistic work that they do, is some of the greatest testaments, some of the greatest achievements that the Iron Age people have actually left us today in the 21st century. But what's incredible as well is the items that are so similar to ours today. I mean, the hammer that I'm using, the anvil, the multitude of tools, my tongs even. These ones here are iron tongs. They're reproduced from examples from Danebury Hill Fort, and they work exactly like our modern tongs, as a modern blacksmith would. They work just the same. So of course the blacksmith's real job, aside from making items that did have artistic merit, was actually making tools and equipment for the community. And so many of those tools would be so familiar in a modern craftspeople's hands, they'd be able to pick them up and use them instinctively. So we have a few here, and all of these are reproductions. We copy them from the archaeology and make them using materials as close to the originals as we can, to the dimensions of the originals. Now fantastically, we have some nice familiar bits of equipment here. We have our iron adze and axe here as well. As we say, incredibly familiar. What people always find quite amazing is just how long we've had things like bill hooks. Fantastically useful and diverse tools and equipment. But some of my favourite have to be things like this iron saw from Danebury Hill Fort again. People tend not to think the Iron Age peoples had things like files and saws. For some reason we've got this into our head that it was really technologically advanced, but no, we were using pretty much the same tools and equipment we have today as craftsmen. Of course, not only were they making agricultural implements and tools for everyday life, they were also making weapons for war and also protection. Now, we have a nice shirt of mail here. This would be made out of iron or even some mild steel or low carbon steels that they did have at the time, we know from the archaeology. We have things like simple javelin and spearheads. Just simple things like this would be, your average blacksmith at the time would be able to create something as simple as that and equip most warriors quite quickly. Reproductions of, say, a dagger from Glastonbury Lake Village. This is one of my favourite items, I have to say. Quite lethal looking, but perhaps out of them all, we have our iron sword here. This one I actually made at Chalke Valley a couple of years ago, tested this out on an iron anvil using an iron hammer, seeing just what was capable with the tools and equipment of the Iron Age blacksmith. And then we got to test this out as well on deer carcasses, cutting through flesh and bones, seeing just how effective, how lethal, and I have to say how scary these items would have been. Of course, when we're trying to recreate these items, we're not just trying to focus on the metalwork. We want to make all the other materials suitable as well. So the woods of the handles, we're using things like oak, hazel and ash. We know from the archaeology that's there. But things like the handles of swords and daggers and knives, we have to find that out. We have to look across over 400 records of swords and find out they're using materials like deer and sheep bone and ram's horns as well as wooden handles to produce it all.
Hello, I'm Lara Maiklem and I'm the author of Mudlarking, Lost and Found on the River Thames. This year would have been my first visit to the Chalke Valley History Festival, so I'm really disappointed it's not taking place. But I'm also very honoured to have been invited along to talk to you like this. My book is a gentle amble along the tidal Thames from Teddington out to the estuary, telling the story of the river through the objects that I've found on the foreshore. Because it's tidal, the water goes out twice a day, low enough for me to go down onto the riverbed to search for the objects that have been lost and dumped over the years. And I've found literally thousands of them, dating back more than 2,000 years. So choosing something to talk about today was really, really hard. I thought really hard about it because the things that I like are the ordinary things, just the ordinary everyday possessions of the sort of people who didn't make it into the history books, the forgotten people. And the most ordinary thing I could think of was a comb. Now, you've probably got a plastic version of this in a drawer somewhere in your house. This is made of boxwood and it dates back to around the 16th or 17th century. This side would have been for removing nits and parasites. Everyone had them, visitors that came and stayed. And combs like this were found on the Mary Rose. They found lots of them. Everybody had one. They had little leather pouches they put them in. And the nits were actually preserved in between some of the teeth of the combs they found on the Mary Rose. Now, I've got a very similar plastic one in my bathroom cabinet that I use on the kids, which goes to show why change something that works so well. On the other side, the teeth here were used for taming the hair, for styling it. And I've been told by reenactors that wooden combs are excellent, much better than plastic combs for taming unruly and particularly curly hair. So they worked incredibly well. I should say that this is about half a comb. It would have been about this long. It's been broken, who knows how. Maybe it just wore out. It's been very well used. Perhaps someone trod on it. Maybe someone broke it in half on purpose. We'll never know. It's made of wood. It's been preserved beautifully in the foreshore, and that's the beauty of mudlarking. Thames mud is anaerobic. There's no oxygen in it, so it preserves wood and leather and even fabric as perfectly as the day it was lost or dropped. I found shoes with the imprint of the previous owner's foot in, the heel and the little toes, and finding objects like that, reaching back through time into the mud and touching these objects that nobody else has touched for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is what makes mudlarking so absolutely magical.
Speeding. So I believe Bournemouth have been working with you for about 3 years.
Yeah, Beth, we've had the privilege of having Bournemouth University associated with the Chalke Valley History Festival for, this is the third year, and we're just delighted because, isn't it one of the best media universities in the UK?
Sure.
And isn't this one of the best courses?
Yeah, I mean, it's renowned for the course.
And the quality of the students that come through it.
For sure.
You know, we've only experienced really, really good volunteers, and we couldn't do this without you. The team brings a completely different buzz and different energy because we're all set in old school, and you're all set in new ways of thinking and new ways of promoting and new ways of filming, and that for us is a huge, huge bonus. We love having you.
The Chalke Valley History Festival has been very fortunate over the last few years to strike up a fantastic relationship with Bournemouth University, which has one of the best film schools anywhere in the country. Students come here every single year and they put together some absolutely fantastic footage and films and all sorts of other bits and pieces. What we're about to see now was shown to all the staff at the very end of the festival. It's never been shown to the public before. It's known as the Stride Guide, and it shows that we don't like to take ourselves too seriously all of the time.
Yeah, okay, so then Oh, hi, sorry, I didn't see that. Hi, my name's Lewis and welcome to the Stride Guide. Now this is going to be your one-stop tour to the Chalke Valley History Festival. Now if you'd like to come with me, come on. What are we going to see today?
Guide number 1, getting stuck in. As you can imagine, the festival is teeming with things to do and stuff to get involved with. One of the best ways to get stuck in is to simply talk to the historians and the reenactors. They absolutely love it when you bring your best questions to them, and if you're very lucky, they might even let you try on some of their costumes, test out some of their props, or even sit on one of their tanks. so many different events going on all the time that it won't take you long to stumble onto something that you love. Be brave, be passionate, and let history transport you into the past. Guide number 2. Learn something new. What better way to spend your day than to come out with a head full of newfound history facts? With Chalke Valley, the key is to come in with an open mind. You think you know your stuff, do you? Well, put that to the test with the reenactors and historians in the history tents all around the site. Just by asking one question could lead you to a whole debate about the best time period, the best way to use an open fire, or maybe which type of cannon is the loudest. Choose a time period you don't know much about. You'll be surprised by just how much there is to learn. And be sure to get your way around the entire site, as there is just so much going on at both ends. Or if you're very lucky, perhaps even hitch a lift. Ask questions, take notes, and let the rest be history. Guide number 3. Festival well. With great festival comes great responsibility, and at Chalke Valley there is no exception. It's time to splash the cash and munch on some lunch. 3 of my personal festival highlights include the Emporium, a place for you to peruse a collection of garments, try on some fabulous hats, and of course, taste some of the finest wines and spirits. The food court. With so many tasty stalls, how could you ever go hungry? No matter what you're eating, you're sure to be treated to some fresh goodness from some of the best foodies around. The classes and stalls. Leap into history and try out some of the authentic workshops from across the site. Find out where your true skills lie and put your history knowledge to the test. Get that history game on and festival to the max.